Hi, I'm Lillian. Welcome back to my channel, Ink and Pages. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read this summer. So we'll start with the one book I finished in June, and that is Infamous by Lex Croucher. This was the second one of their books I have read. It's another Regency one. This time I would say is a fully fledged Regency romance between two best friends for pretty much all of their life, Eddie and Rose. And they've always been very, very close. They're best friends. But now their dynamic is kind of changing because Eddie doesn't want to, join society and be this traditional idea of a lady and find a husband and have children. But Rose very much is interested in that. And so, yeah, things are changing between them. And Eddie, she's an aspiring author, and she's also kind of pig-headed in that she doesn't really have any concept of why Rose would be interested in things that she herself is not interested in. This was such a fun and sweet romance in a way that I almost wasn't expecting, which was dumb because I went in knowing it was a Regency romance, so I don't know why I was surprised that it was romantic, but it was very sweet and very romantic, and there were actually plenty of almost like swoony moments, which I really liked, and I really enjoyed this. I think maybe I wasn't expecting it so much because I knew from the blurb that they go and stay in this like crumbling Gothic manor house, and so I was expecting something, a bit more like dramatic and Gothic, and I guess so was Eddie, because so they go to the manor house and it turns out to be less dramatic and Gothic and more like moldy and kind of sad, and so that was a negative surprise for Eddie, but I, upon not getting what I expected, was having a much better time. Some parts of this were slightly frustrating in that there is a side character who, from the moment they appeared on the page, I was like, you are a shit, and I can tell. And the other characters took a little bit longer to wise up to that fact that this person was a complete dick, and I was like, I knew, I had you pegged from the start. And I also slightly wish that the ending had been more of a cathartic kind of showdown than they necessarily ended up being. But having said that, it was still a very fun time, a very strong book, one I would really recommend. And I especially loved how all of the characters felt so 3D and realistic, and they all had good and bad qualities. So like even the one that I really didn't like from the beginning and I knew was going to be trouble, they also had some positive qualities, and I could see why everyone liked them. And then the dynamics between all of the characters, but I guess also mainly the central dynamic between Eddie and Rose, it felt really real and complex, and it was just really well done. So I ended up giving this, I think, a 3.5 star. I think it was very strong and one I would highly recommend to anyone. The next book I read was A Street Cat Named Bob by James Bowen. This is a true story. It's an autobiography about this guy, James, who was living in sheltered housing when he met a stray cat, one of the best cats ever, called Bob, and eventually decided to take him in and like be his owner and take care of him. And it's just this really sweet story. It's not very long and it's not very complex, and the writing is very simple. And I've seen some people in reviews like really criticize the writing and like, no, he's not going to win the Nobel Prize for literature for this book, but it's perfectly suited to the kind of story it is, in that it's sweet and it's simple and it's easy to read, and it was fine. It was really nice to read about how they kind of both take care of each other in their different ways. It's a very emotional book actually in places, and it does touch on some deeper and darker stuff. And so I do think that the ending didn't quite pack as much of a punch as I'd hoped. Like the book doesn't so much end as it just kind of stops. So I think it could have been slightly differently crafted just to give it that bit of oomph that I think it really deserved. Next, I read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. This is the third one of her books I've read, and I think it is going to be the last. This is about a group of friends who take a trip to Scotland to stay in this like lodge, and it's mainly based around this group of, I think, university friends. I think they're the core of it, and some of their partners come along, and as is often the case in thrillers like this, they all like kind of secretly hate each other and like resent each other's guts, and it's like, why are you still friends? You don't like each other. Just get over it, give it up. But my number one piece of feedback about this book is that I saw every single plot point coming. Like, I could have read the first 30 pages of this, skipped to the end, and I would have been able to tell you literally every single secret that was revealed, every twist. I could have almost immediately guessed with quite good accuracy who the murder victim was going to be and who the murderer was. This is structured kind of similarly to Lucy Foley's other book, the first book of hers I read, oh my god, what's it called? The Guest List, in that you don't find out even who the murder victim is until quite far near the end. And then like a few pages after that, you'll find out who the murderer was. So I think in The Guest List, that worked really well at kind of keeping the stakes and the tension high. In this one, because I knew immediately everything that was happening and every secret the characters are keeping from each other, did not work for me. Did not work at all. There's like 4, I think, characters whose POVs we read from, and there's so much switching between them, and it was deeply irritating because almost nothing was happening, almost no information, like relevant information was being learned, and you would switch from one to the other for nothing to happen, and then you'd switch to another character and nothing would happen, and then eventually you'd switch to a character and they'd reveal a secret, and like maybe that was interesting if you didn't see it coming, but I saw it all coming and I was like, yeah, I knew that. And then that just went on for 300 pages and then it finished exactly how I thought it would. And I was like, cool, what a waste of time. The entire thing felt very slow and stale, and all I can really compare it to is Ruth Ware's books. And even when I've read her books where I have been able to guess what's going on, I think she just is a better writer. So like even when, what was the book? I think it was Into the Woods, The Dark Woods, something about woods. I guessed almost immediately what was going on and what was happening, but it was still interesting because of the way she wrote it, and this was definitely not. So I'm done with Lucy Foley for now. The Guest List was good. The other 2 books I've read from her have been very disappointing, and I think this is the end for us. Next, I read, without even meaning to, an accidentally very similar book, and one that I enjoyed even less. It was another thriller. It was called Rock, Paper, Scissors by Alice Feeney. This has a similar premise in that this time it is a married couple, and they go to Scotland on a holiday, and it's snowy and they get snowed in. It's a very similar premise. And again, they like obviously hate each other's guts, and their marriage is like crumbling, and so this is an attempt to have a holiday together and save their relationship. And I'm like, this is beyond saving. Like, you clearly don't like each other. Just get out of it. You'll be much happier single and completely out of each other's lives. Of course, it's never that simple. You know, they're keeping secrets from each other, and it's like, oh, okay, I would. You're terrible people. You're miserable, and you make each other miserable, and you're making me miserable by reading about you. The gimmick of this book, like the main premise, is that the husband in the relationship has face blindness, and so he cannot recognize people by looking at them, and he's also quite bad at like knowing what anyone looks like in general, and even like telling how old people are, because he just can't do it. He just can't do it. And I was like, okay, intriguing. And I had all these theories about how this was going to play out. I was like, my number one theory was that halfway through the book, his wife was going to be like replaced by an imposter who was like secretly obsessed with him, and he wouldn't be able to tell because of his face blindness, and he would think it was the same person, or possibly that like this has happened multiple times and everyone's lying to him. And I had all of these really, really cool concepts in my head, and I was like, if only any of those had been at all close to what actually happened. And like, is this book, is it a thriller? Is it a suspense thriller? Is that what this is meant to be? Because almost nothing happened. And I was like, this isn't very thrilling at all. And this isn't very suspenseful at all. And there's also not much of a mystery to it because nothing is happening. So I think the main like premise, the gimmick, did feel very wasted. Again, like, is this a thriller author thing where you think the only way to build tension is to have very, very short chapters and to constantly be switching POVs, and you end each chapter with like a little bit of an ominous zinger to keep the reader on their toes, to keep them wanting more? And like, is that all you have? You're not actually going to write an interesting book with interesting characters your one technique for building tension is to have short, pointless chapters and you end with like a little zinger every time. It was awful. So by the time I got to the end, like, I can even, in hindsight, appreciate that the way it ended, it had the potential to be kind of interesting, but at that point, I'd read 400 pages of nothingness, of characters I hated doing dumb things. And I was like, I don't care. I'm so done. Like, you deserve everything that's happening to you. Like, this is awful. It was so bad. Like, it's one of the worst books I've read this year. I'm giving it a 1.5. I actually can't believe I finished it. Definitely should have DNF'd it. And I'm just so not tempted to ever read from this author again. However, the next book I read was amazing. It's a 5-star, I'll tell you that right now. It was Trouble by Lex Croucher. I loved this book. I read this while on holiday with my family. I actually read it like on the way to the holiday, in one sitting pretty much. I started reading it when we got on the Eurotunnel. Just as we got underground, I started reading it, and then I continued reading it for like the next 5 or 6 hours as we drove through France to a town called Le Mans. And I risked travel sickness to read this book because I can't read in the car. I'm fine on trains and planes, but buses and cars, I can't do it. I will even get car sick from like looking at my phone too much while I'm in the car. And I've always been very jealous of people who can read in the car. However, I've hacked it. The trick is you have to hold it, like you can't hold it on your lap and read it down here. You have to hold it up so you can see the horizon in the background. And it also helps if you're just like really, really loving the book and don't want to put it down, which is exactly the case with this. I loved it to the point where as I was reading it, my brain was trying to like freak me out and go, are you loving this as much as you think? Do you think this is going to be a 4-star? Do you think this is going to be a 4.5? Or the ending might really disappoint you? And I just had to be like, shut up brain, I'm having a great time, I'll think about it later. And then I finished it and I was like, I love this so much. It's not really a conversation. I'm gonna give it 5 stars. So this is a Regency romance about a woman called Emily, and Emily's sister is a governess and she gets a new job, but then she falls ill and she can't go, and they really, really need the money. So Emily goes along, pretends to be her sister, and goes to this house and meets a Navy captain called Captain Edwards and his 2 children, and she is not a governess. She doesn't like children. She has no experience teaching them, and she's also quite grumpy. And I loved Emily so much. She is one of my favorite characters I've read from in years and years and years. She is the grumpy, angry, furious, prickly, standoffish heroine of my dreams, and I would kill for her. The writing is so fun. This author does a really good job of keeping it, you know, Regency and old-fashioned, but also making it feel modern enough to be fun, and it walks that line perfectly, and it was such a good time. I loved like almost everything about this. I loved Emily and Captain Edwards. I loved how much they argued. I loved every argument they had, of which there were many. This was just such a fun time, and this is the 3rd book from this author I've read. I'm gonna read everything else they read from now on, I've decided. It really came out of nowhere and genuinely surprised me when it shouldn't have, and I adore it, and I want to absorb this book into my brain and have it live there forever. 5-star, favorite of this year. I finished one other book while on this holiday with my family, and that was Gallant by V.E. Schwab. And I picked this up because I really like spooky houses, you know, gothic castles and haunted or maybe not so haunted houses. I love all of that. I like the spooky, eerie vibes, and that's very much what this promised to deliver. This is about a girl called Olivia, and she's an orphan that she finds out she has a long lost uncle, and she's invited to go and stay at his house, which is called Gallant. When she gets there, he's dead. He's been dead for a while. So it's like, who invited her? What's going on? And there may or may not be a kind of hidden away mirror shadow version of the house. Think like Coraline vibes, and it's dangerous and spooky, and it's like, what's going on there? That sounds really cool. Love that premise. However, this book didn't quite hit as hard as I was hoping it would. Olivia herself was like a fine enough, kind of interesting main character. However, all of the other characters were just kind of there, and they didn't feel very fleshed out at all. And I think you could say that pretty much about this whole book. The concept, the core concept was fine and was interesting, but it didn't need to be 300 pages long. It felt very watered down as a story, and I think it would have worked a lot better and felt stronger and like tighter if it had been a novella, perhaps like maybe 150 pages instead of a full-length book. The storyline that is in this book does not warrant the number of pages that actually fills. I was really torn about what genre to put this as, like whether it would be paranormal or fantasy. I've gone with fantasy. I think that works slightly better for it because Olivia can see ghosts, except they're not called ghosts, they're called ghouls. And they were kind of freaky and interesting, but we never got enough of that to satisfy me, and it was never really explained. And the magic that's like introduced later on was again never really explained, and that was kind of irritating. And I think if it had been a shorter book, I wouldn't have needed that, because I would have been so invested in it, would have felt stronger and left me with fewer questions, when actually in a 300-page book I think you could have answered a lot more of them than this did. One final gripe, which is kind of a spoiler, I won't say specifics, but it's kind of a spoiler, is I really hate it when a character is injured, like I know they get like stabbed or shot dramatically or something, and then all the other characters just kind of circle around them, and it's like, oh, what a sad moment in the story, they're dying. And I'm like, but call an ambulance, call a doctor. Like, are you sure that's a fatal wound? I'm not. I think if you called an ambulance, they might survive, but instead you've just decided that like, oh, it's their time to go, it's what the story needs. And I'm reading it like, no, you could have easily called for help and got a doctor and possibly saved this character's life. So this was just a bit disappointing overall. I'm giving it a 2.5. It had promise, but it did not deliver. Next, I read a classic. Not only did I read a classic, I read a 500-page classic. That was Dracula by Bram Stoker. I listened to an audiobook of this, which was actually really, really great. I would highly recommend this audiobook. It was full cast. I thought it was amazing. My one gripe about the audiobook is that none of the narrators was doing the same accent when they were doing Van Helsing's voice. Van Helsing is Dutch. Nobody could quite do the Dutch accent. To be fair, it's a hard accent to do, I get that. But someone was doing like a kind of Germanic accent, someone sounded Swedish, someone sounded like Slavic, Russian. It was interesting. But this book was kind of a fun time. This story is so famous, and like literally everyone has heard of Count Dracula, that I wasn't expecting it to be as much fun as it was in parts. Like a lot of it is kind of dull, and I'll get to that, but actually there are a lot of moments which were thrilling and exciting, which I didn't remember. I've read this before, like ages and ages ago, and I remembered mainly the barest of bones to like the first quarter of the book, and that's just because the opening is so iconic. Like it's Jonathan Harker, and he goes to Castle Dracula and meets Dracula, and it's spooky. It's like the #1 gothic castle of fiction, in my opinion, and it's such an iconic beginning to the story that like no wonder that's the only bit I remembered going in. I would say that opening sequence is probably the best bit, along with I actually really liked when it tells the story of the Demeter, which is a ship that travels from Transylvania to Whitby. Like that bit was kind of spooky actually, and I liked that a lot. I also really liked the part about the Bloofer lady. That was actually genuinely bone-chilling and much more terrifying than I thought a Victorian book would be. Like a lot of the thrills and scare factor is a lot tamer to what we now expect from like a horror vampire story, but like actually those bits were genuinely quite terrifying. Then on the other side of things, we have plenty of boring bits. The entire plot line of Dr. Seward and his asylum and his patient Renfield, who he interacts with a lot, is like, no joke, completely irrelevant to the plot. And it takes up like a third of the book, and it's actually no joke, 99% irrelevant to the plot. Like it did not need to be there. And every time we went back to Dr. Seward's diary notes, I was like, oh God, this guy again. Oh my God, it's so boring. The book is an epistolary novel, so it's told mostly through diary entries of the different characters and like the odd telegram or letter they send each other, and there's a couple of newspaper clippings in there as well. And I actually didn't hate this. When I read Frankenstein, really hated the epistolary novel format. I think that's maybe because Frankenstein was a lot worse than Dracula. I think that's probably why I didn't like it. I actually didn't hate the fact that this was told through diary entries and letters. What I did not like, what I did not appreciate, was about halfway through to 75% of the way through. That's where all the different characters are kind of coming together and realizing that they're all part of the same story and they need to like team up and share their experiences. And there's so much emphasis on how they all bring their diaries in and they compile their diaries, and one of the characters, Mina, is like typing up the diary entries and compiling this big volume of all of their records. And it's like, guys, I'm here to read about the scary vampire, not so you can harp on about your record keeping prowess. Like, I don't care about the bureaucratic element. I wasn't reading it going, wow, I wonder how they got all these diaries together to make one complete volume to tell the story. It's like, just tell the story. Another annoying thing, it's to be expected, it's an old Victorian novel. So whenever they talk about gender, it's always like, oh, the women are these pure, meek, nurturing creatures. And the only thing that can help a man when he's heavy of heart is the kind touch of a woman's hand. And it's like, okay, there's a lot of that. And they talk a lot about wanting to protect the women. And at one point they try and protect Mina by not telling her what's going on. And immediately that is to her, their, and the story's detriment. And I'm like, guys, just tell her what's going on. And they realize that eventually, but I was like, come on guys, let's not be ridiculous about this. You need all the help you can get. Don't shut out, like, not even like unarguably the cleverest member of the gang. Let's not shut her out just because she has a uterus. However, I would say the biggest flaw of this book, and this is one that is entirely not the character's fault, but the biggest flaw is that they don't know they're in the book Dracula. And so at the beginning, when Jonathan Harker is going to Castle Dracula, it's absolutely hilarious to read it in 2023 and for him to be like, oh, it's this scary castle on top of a mountain, and maybe he seems to be able to command the wolves and the bats that live around, and it's really spooky and I don't see anyone else, and all the local villagers keep giving me crucifixes and telling me they'll pray for me when I tell them that I'm going to see Dracula. And like, wonder what that's about. And you're like, he's a vampire. But of course, Jonathan Harker doesn't know this, but you're reading it and you're like, dude, he's a vampire. That's what's going on. And later on, one of the characters, they'll be like, oh, she's woken up this morning, but she's so pale and listless and lethargic. And she seems to have lost a lot of blood. And there's puncture wounds on her neck. Wonder what's going on there. So I have many strong opinions on this book, but I'm also kind of deeply obsessed with it. And I am now rewatching like a lot of Dracula adaptions to see what they get right, and it's very interesting, and most of them aren't very good. And so even though I'm actually rating this book a 2.5 star, I'm kind of deeply obsessed with it and will need to get myself an actual copy of this book. But then finally, I wrapped up the summer by rereading 3 books. First of all, I reread the first 2 volumes in the Monstress graphic novel series. This is by Marge Liu and Sana Takeda. The first volume is Awakening. The second volume is The Blood. This is like an annual reread for me at this point because a new volume comes out every year. And so each year I will reread all the previous volumes and then read the new one. That's what's going on here, although so far I've only reread these first 2. This first volume, I think, might be the perfect opening book to a series. Like, it's an annual reread and it's an annual reminder of how much I fucking love this series. Like, it's just so good. This is the perfect opening book. It sets everything up so well. It is the perfect level of complex and intriguing. It's so well crafted as a story, as a world, and as all the characters, almost all the characters. And I just love it so much. An immediate repeat 5-star for me. Volume 2, not quite as good. I felt like this time round, it didn't, specifically in terms of the world building and the vibe, I don't think it delivered on what the first volume was promising to set up. Like, it was still very good. I think I'm going to give it a 3.5 star this time. And I liked the setting. It was kind of like a sea setting, but it just wasn't as good. And one of the characters in here, this like fox character, is called Kipper. She's really annoying. And this is the first volume where she is proven to be really annoying. So that was a bit of a downside. But this series is great. Can't wait to reread the other volumes I have. And lastly, I decided to reread Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I decided to pick this back up because I watched the film. So a film adaptation came out recently on, I think, Amazon Prime. And I watched it and I was like, that was fine. But it wasn't great and it wasn't what I was hoping. And I think they got the general vibe and the basic story beats are there. But I think the thing they changed the most was the character of Alex. So this is a book about Alex, who is the son of the President of America, and then Prince Henry, who is a Prince of England, and their relationship, and it's wonderful. But I really think they changed Alex the most. I think in the film, he just comes off as like a bit dumber, and like when people say someone has like golden Labrador energy, like golden retriever energy, yeah, he has like dog energy, but in the book he's very much cat energy, and I think that's the best way to describe it. So like, it's a fine film, and that's the most I'll say. It's fine. They also randomly took out Alex's sister. They changed a lot. It's fine, but I watched it and I was like, that's not scratching the itch that I wanted it to. I'm gonna have to reread the book, and I did, and the book is great. It's just so much fun. It's a wonderful little romance. This is the 3rd or 4th time I've read it, and I've reviewed it on my channel like the last time I reread it. So I don't have much more to say. Like, it's not perfect, but it's great. And it's wonderful, and it's happy, and it's joyous, and it's also very emotional at times. And like, yeah, it's just everything. It's the real deal. It's everything wrapped into one, and it's amazing. And I loved it. It remains one of my all-time favorite books, and I'm just happy it exists. But I hope you also enjoyed all of the books that you read this summer, or at least most of them. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in my next one.